Will you please sign in the witness?
Please raise your right
Oh,
hand.
yes.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Will you please state and spell your name for the record?
My name is Gary Delagnes. I spell it G-A-R-Y. It's my first name. My last name is D-E-L-A-G-N-E-S.
Mr. Delganes, what is your current place of employment?
San Francisco Police Officers Association.
Okay. How long have you been an employee of the? Do you mind if I call the Police Officers Association the POA from now on?
No, I do not.
Okay. How many years have you been in that position with the POA?
Since I retired in September of 2013.
Okay. And what is your role at the POA currently?
Public Relations and Legislative Advisor.
And prior to being employed by the POA in that capacity, where were you employed?
I was employed by the San Francisco Police Department for 35 years, from 1978 to 2013. The last 10 years of that was president of the San Francisco Police Officers Association, where I was assigned to the Police Officers Association by the San Francisco Police Department.
Okay. And we'll get into your history with the department as well as the POA a little bit more as we go along. But just by way of background and particularly as to why we're here, are you aware of the so-called blue ribbon panel formed by current District Attorney George Gascon to investigate the San Francisco Police Department?
Yes.
Okay. To your knowledge, what was the genesis of Mr. Gascon creating the blue ribbon panel?
To the best of my knowledge, it emanated from the text messaging that occurred in the past couple of years that involved 14 of our officers, who in fact only 7 of those 14 had sent any racially divisive text messages. But I believe that what came out of that was Mr. Gascon's belief that there may be a systemic racial problem in the San Francisco Police Department.
Okay. You mentioned that the text message, there were some text messages that were racist. Do you recall any other issues with the text messages, homophobia, anything of that nature?
I never actually saw the text of the messages, but as I understood, it was involving racial derogatory remarks of a racial nature, and also derogatory remarks from a homophobic nature.
Okay. And when you heard about that, what was your reaction?
I was very disappointed. I was disgusted. I was very surprised that our officers, even though it was a very small group of them, would have been so naive and ignorant, not only to say those things, but I don't know if they actually believed what they were saying. I'd like to believe that they were just the musings of people on text saying stupid things, but very disappointed in our members.
All right. And even if it were simply musing, what do you believe that would be appropriate?
Absolutely not. It's not something that's accepted in our department. Never has been accepted in our department. We've come a long way. We celebrate our diversity, and I believe that we have the most diverse police department in the United States. I believe that with my heart and soul.
Do you recall whether the POA had any public reaction to the revelations of those text messages?
We were outraged. We supported the chief, and we took a very strong position in opposition to the content of those text messages, and we provided legal defense, as we were required to do under the bylaws, for the officers involved. But other than that, we were repulsed. And
do you recall current POA President Martin Halloran issuing a statement about the text messages?
yes,
Okay. And how would you characterize that statement?
in short, he condemned the text messaging. He supported the chief's efforts to basically root these folks out of the police department. They were suspended, and we supported the chief in taking those officers off the street.
Okay.
And but again, you know, under the bylaws and under the structure of our organization, we were compelled to represent them.
When you say we were compelled to represent them, are you referring to the POA or the POA's separate legal defense
The
fund?
legal defense fund of the POA, under the bylaws, was required to provide legal defense for these officers regardless of our repulsion. They were entitled to a defense as anyone else is in this country.
Okay. All right, let's shift gears to get a little bit more about you and your personal background. What was your place of birth and location of your upbringing?
I was actually born in Antioch, California. My father was over there for a very short period of time trying to start a business, but I was raised in San Francisco since I was 6 months old.
All right, and where in San Francisco did you live?
I was raised primarily in the Sunset District of San Francisco.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing, how you were raised by your parents in terms of, well, any number of things, but I guess one thing I'd want to focus on is in regard to kind of acceptance of people who are different than yourself.
Well, I grew up in San Francisco in the 1960s, and I was raised by two very liberal, democratic parents who were tremendous followers of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They loved John Kennedy. Both my parents lived during the Depression and World War II, and they were lifelong Democrats. I was raised in San Francisco. I was being raised at a time we were seeing the Haight-Ashbury, we were seeing the Civil Rights Movement, we were seeing the Gay Rights Movement, and I was raised by my parents from a very early age that to accept all people, regardless of their lifestyle, their ethnicity. Everybody's to be treated equally. And I remember even as a kid, my father and mother used to take us to dinner at a restaurant down on Polk Street, May's Oyster House, which was at the time a very huge part of the gay movement over on Polk Street. And as a young kid, I was seeing men with men, and my dad said, "Hey, everybody just wants to find somebody," and we were taught at a very early age that there was we're very receptive to other lifestyles, and no bigotry would have ever been tolerated in my family or my house.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your educational background.
Catholic, went to St. Anne's Grammar School in the Sunset, went to St. Ignatius High School in San Francisco, graduated in 1972, and went to the University of San Francisco, another Jesuit institution, and I got out in 1976, and I went back in 1982 to finish up for about 30 units. I got my degree ultimately in 1982.
All right. All right. Well, let's talk about your career with the San Francisco Police Department. When did you join the department and go through the academy?
I was sworn in on June 26, 1978.
And I think you said you were. Am I correct that you testified that you were with the department for 35 years?
Yes.
Okay. But the last 10 of those you were serving full time as the POA president?
From March of 2004 to my retirement in June of 2013.
Okay. So tell me what your first assignment was.
I went through the field training program in the Mission District, stayed there for about 4 or 5 months, and I was transferred over to Central Station in 1979, and spent primarily the next 10 or 11 years there, working primarily midnights, mostly in the Tenderloin. I had the irregular assignment of the Tenderloin car, and I worked there, and then I walked the beat from midnight to 8 a.m. for about 3 years, all in the Tenderloin. And then in 1988, I transferred to the Tactical Division. I spent 2 years at the Tactical Division, and then I believe in 1990 I was promoted to the rank of Inspector. And from 1990 through 1991 through 2004, I was primarily a team leader in the Narcotics Division, enforcing narcotics laws in the city and county of San Francisco with a team.
Okay. And then after that, you began to serve as the POA president?
I was elected, yeah. I wasn't the first time I took over for the president who was retiring, and then I was reelected subsequently 3 times after that.
Okay. And actually, we'll shift gears in a moment to talk more about your history with the POA. But let's talk about your time on patrol in the Tenderloin. What was the demographic in the Tenderloin at the time that you were on patrol there?
It was mostly made up of lower income people, SROs, low cost housing, transient hotels, a lot of parolees, a lot of minorities, basically a lot of poverty stricken people, and also a lot of people who are just trying to move forward in their life and survive because of the high cost of living in San Francisco. There was a very large Vietnamese population. As they immigrated after the Vietnam War, they kind of took over a little neighborhood in the Tenderloin. And generally, a lot of people down on their luck, a lot of drug dealers, a lot of drug addicts, a lot of prostitution, and also a lot of really good people, a lot of elderly people that were just trying to make it to the next day. And you know, I saw my role down there as you know, basically keeping the good folks from the bad folks and letting people live their lives unimpeded.
Did you try to foster good relationships with members of the community?
Absolutely. That was a big part of my job, especially on the beat. Absolutely essential for any effective cop to build a relationship and a rapport with the people in the district so that they will come to you with information. And that was a huge part of my job in the Tenderloin, was to develop relationships with, whether it be grocery store owners, whether it be prostitutes who would give us information about, you know, pimps, drug dealers, drug addicts, hotel managers, you know, the whole gamut.
Okay. And that kind of fostering of relationships with the community, is that something that the department itself encourages?
Absolutely.
All right, let's talk about your service with the POA. What was your first involvement with the POA?
I ran for vice president in 1990, and I won. And I served as vice president from 1990 until I became president in 2004. So I spent about 14 years as vice president of the association before I became president.
And your time as vice president, you were still a working cop at that time?
Yes,
Okay.
that was the whole time I was in narcotics. Most of it, almost all of it was narcotics. Yeah.
Okay. And then you're president beginning in 2004 until your retirement in 2013?
Right, correct.
All right. I want to talk about your your background with current current district attorney George Gascon. When did you first have occasion to come to know DA Gascon?
I first heard his name from then Mayor Gavin Newsom, who had floated his name out there as a potential candidate for chief of police of San Francisco, and we discussed his background as well as the background of other candidates that were being looked at that time. It seemed to me that the Mayor Newsom seemed particularly impressed with Mr. Gascon's background and his career in Los Angeles and his current assignment as chief of police of Mesa, Arizona. And they seemed particularly impressed with his willingness to take on Sheriff Arapo down there, and I guess him being the sheriff of that county and George Gascon being chief of Mesa, they were butting heads on immigration issues always, and San Francisco seemed happy, or the mayor seemed happy with his views on immigration and his leadership from a progressive position.
So did the mayor actively seek out yours, the POA's input?
Yes.
Okay. And how were you involved in the process?
The mayor at the time told me, whether it was true or not, that the ultimate decision on who the chief would be mine. And that while they would recommend 3 or 4 candidates, that if their particular candidate was not acceptable to the POA, they wouldn't get the job. And I think the reason for that was because At the time, we were somewhat upset that they were going outside the department. So I think that the mayor felt that he, at least if he was going to go outside the department, that we should have considerable input into who, in fact, it was going to be.
Okay. And at the end of the day, were you okay with that choice?
Yeah, I looked into his background. I talked to people in Los Angeles PD. I talked to people in the Mesa Police Department. He was described. Everybody had an opinion about him. The general overall opinion was that he was a very ambitious guy, but also a very bright guy, and could do a lot worse.
Okay. So in fact, he was appointed police chief, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall meeting with him at that time?
Yeah, I met with him the day he was appointed. As a matter of fact, I received a call from him on the day of his appointment, and he said, I understand I'm getting the job, and I understand that you have a lot of input, and so I'm flying up there today, and I'd like to meet with you. And we did meet, myself, George Gascon, and Chief of Staff Steve Cava. We met at Don Ramon's restaurant, and we spoke for about 2 hours.
Okay. Do you recall the length of his term as chief?
Yeah, he was there for 17 months.
Okay. And during his term as chief, did you have regular communications with him?
I don't think anybody in the police department knew him better than I, or met with him more than I, for a lot of different reasons. We met or spoke on the phone at least 2 to 3 times a week for the 17-month period. I think one of the reasons why he trusted me or reached out to me is because he didn't believe that he was very well received by the cops, because he was an outsider. Sure. And I think that he didn't trust a lot of people internally. And I thought that we had built up a relationship of at least mutual respect where we could talk and understand the roles that both of us had.
Okay, so I think you said you talked 2 or 3 times a week. What were the topics of conversation?
Every issue, from disciplinary issues through crime solving, through progressive programs that he might want to put forth, through personnel decisions, through command staff decisions, and who should be on the command staff, who shouldn't be on the command staff, who did I believe was qualified, who did I think was not doing a very good job, what captains did I think were good. I actually gave him a written position paper on all the captains at the police department at his bequest, and I also gave him input, and he asked my input on many personnel issues on a daily basis.
Okay. Do you recall then Chief Gascon ever asking you to serve under him in any particular capacity?
At one point in the relationship, I know that he was somewhat frustrated by what he perceived, I think, as a lack of talent in the upper echelons of the San Francisco Police Department. And at one point he asked me if, when I retired, because he knew that I was going to be retiring, or before I retired, would I be interested in serving the department in some sort of an ombudsman capacity, to sort of, go out and handle disciplinary issues at the district stations, minor disciplinary issues, or just sort of be a mediator on discipline throughout the department. And we talked about possibly me doing that, and what my position would be, or what my rank would be, and would this be pre-retirement, post-retirement, how would that all work? We talked about that for a while.
And what was the ultimate result of that?
Nothing came of it. I didn't feel that that it was going to be a good fit for me. I felt that as head of the union, as a 35-year cop, that the members would not be receptive of me doing that, and would see me as somewhat selling out. And And my biggest reason was, that I just. It wasn't going to be a good fit for me. It wasn't my thing. I didn't want to work for George Gascon or any other chief of police for that reason. If I did, I would have promoted through the department, took tests.
Okay. All right. Shifting gears. Are you aware that current DA Gascon testified before his own blue ribbon panel that we discussed earlier?
Yes.
Okay. Were you present when that occurred?
No.
Okay. Were you informed of the substance of his testimony?
Yes.
And how were you informed? Did you receive a transcript, summary?
I received a summary of his testimony based on our lawyers that were there, or observed his. I think it might have been you, as a matter of fact, Jonathan, that gave. I saw the position paper summarizing George Gascon's testimony in front of the Blue Ribbon Committee. Yes.
All right, so let me ask you some specifics. Are you aware that Gascon testified before the Blue Ribbon panel that the POA tried to obstruct his efforts to create a what's called a Brady policy?
Yes.
Okay. And just for those who don't know, what is a Brady policy?
It emanates from a 1963 Supreme Court decision, Brady versus Maryland, and in a nutshell, it involves exculpatory information on a police officer that may be germane to any particular criminal case that should be turned over to the defense. For example, if a police officer had a DUI off duty, and then he was going to testify in a DUI case, the defense would have a right to have that information. So there's a there's a Brady list in most agencies of officers who basically have a tail, where, you know, if they are required to testify in court, that information regarding their past needs to be turned over. It's potential exculpatory evidence that the defense is entitled to.
Okay, thank you. Probably a better explanation than I would have given. All right. Well, so back to his characterization of the POA as obstructing his efforts to create and implement a policy. Do you agree with that characterization?
No, I do not.
Okay. In fact, was the POA involved in helping to craft the policy?
For him to say we were obstructionists is absolute fantasy. He came to me early in his regime as chief and said that, asked why we did not have a Brady policy. And I said, well, we've never had an official Brady policy. And he said that it was sort of standard in most police departments. And I said, okay, well, if that's what we need to do, then maybe we need to sit down and talk about it. And so not only did we negotiate a Brady policy, we negotiated it with the number 2 person in the district attorney's office, Russ Giantini. We set up a phone call conversation for George Gascon to speak to Elizabeth Silver, who's a labor attorney for the Los Angeles Police Union. We did everything we could to cooperate, and eventually, in fact, we did have a Brady policy. We have a Brady policy, and all we did was, go through the meet and confer process and make sure that it was a good Brady policy, and that our members' rights were being protected. And how he could possibly say that we were an obstruction, I have no clue where that's coming from. Just pure fantasy.
I need to change the tape.
Okay, we were talking about the POA's involvement and assistance in crafting a Brady policy with DA Gascon. In fact, off on the policy, right? Okay, shifting gears again. Are you aware from the summary that you received that DA Gascon testified to the Blue Ribbon panel that the police department's discipline process was cumbersome and that the POA was known to slow it down?
Again,
just
yes,
first of all, were you made aware of those
Yes.
statements? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Do you agree with those statements?
Absolutely not. Pure fabrication.
Okay. Did you make any efforts in working with anyone in the department, or excuse me, anyone in the DA's office or the department or the police department to move discipline cases along?
Yeah, I worked specifically with George Gascon at his bequest. When George Gascon became chief of police, one of the first conversations he had is that he inherited 17, I believe 16 or 17 potential termination cases from the prior chief of police. He told me that he wanted to see if he could resolve those cases. I also know that he was a proponent of what's known as progressive discipline, which I could talk briefly about, but the crux of what George Gascon and I did over the next 3 or 4 months was we met almost on a weekly basis, sometimes for dinner, sometimes for coffee, and we would discuss each individual case of the potential termination cases, and I found him to be fair, and we virtually resolved every one of those cases over dinner or over coffee, and they all had satisfactory resolutions to both sides, most of them involving officers who had serious discipline, either having the chance to retire or face termination in front of the commission. Absolutely, it was the contrary of what he's saying. I thought we worked extremely well together to resolve these discipline cases, and he was fair. He was more than fair, and so I don't know where that's possibly coming from.
So it sounds like, in fact, what you're describing is efforts to move things along in the discipline process and eliminate a backlog as opposed to slow the process down.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we spoke about at the time, which I think emanated from Lee Baca's philosophy of progressive discipline, and I absolutely agreed with George on this, was that, you know, if a cop got in trouble, whether it be on duty or off duty, it didn't do really any good to suspend them for, say, 6 months, because you're just going to lose an employee. Progressive discipline spoke to, okay, look, you know, you got a drunk driving or a domestic violence issue off duty, I'm going to give you 3 days off, but if you do it again, you're fired. And I understood that completely, and I agreed with it. And so I was completely in concert with his philosophy on discipline, and I don't know what he's talking about, that we were a deterrent to discipline. I thought we worked really well together, and I don't know how he could deny that.
Okay. Did he ever express criticism regarding the police department's discipline system or other concerns with the system?
I think that he believed that it went too slowly, and he actually proposed something that we had wanted, and George actually proposed discipline arbitration, which we don't have. And I thought that discipline arbitration would be a tremendous benefit for our members. And unfortunately, our members, our board of directors, they didn't want discipline arbitration, which is almost unbelievable to me at the time. And I told them very strongly that I thought that we should pursue this if the chief was in favor of it. They did not want discipline arbitration. So the biggest problem in the disciplinary process isn't with the POA. It was with the cumbersome procedures at the police commission that would virtually leave cases sitting there for months and months and months at a time, because the commissioners didn't have the time, the individual commissioners, to review all the data. So there was a huge backlog. It had nothing to do with the POA. Okay. And so all the discipline cases that I had direct control over, which were discipline cases that George and I could solve one-on-one, we did, and I thought we worked really well together. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to come forward to the Blue Ribbon Committee, because I would love to hear Mr. Gascon expound upon what that meant to him, that we were a deterrent or I don't get it.
All right, fair enough. All right, again, shifting gears. Are you aware that D.A. Gascon testified to the Blue Ribbon panel that he believes there is systemic or institutionalized racism within the San Francisco Police Department?
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely not, and that's the biggest reason why I wanted to come forward.
During his term as chief of police, do you recall him stating a belief or concern regarding racial, gender, sexual orientation, or other improper bias within the police department?
Never once in 17 months did George Gascon say one word to me involving any belief that he had that there was any sort of a systemic racist problem in our department. On the contrary, he told me many times that he thought that our police officers connected with the community beautifully, better than in LA, because of their paramilitary attitudes down there. He was frustrated. He had told me on more than one occasion he was frustrated with our officers' lack of paramilitary decorum. To him, that meant, you know, shine shoes, standard shirts under the uniforms, because LA is very militaristic on the way they dress. And I would tell George at the time, look, you know, I mean, this is what San Francisco wants. This is what we're about. And he agreed. I mean, I don't know how many times he would compliment our officers on how well they blended in and how diverse they were and connected with the community. So again, absolutely not true that he ever mentioned one word to anybody that I know of, including myself or anybody at the mayor, that there was any proposed systemic racism in our department. Just ridiculous.
No such statements ever made.
No such statement ever.
And you never heard that such statements were made by him to others?
Never.
Okay. Do you recall an event when then Chief Gascon ordered a sweep of the Tenderloin?
I do.
Okay. Can you tell me about what you recall happening?
One of his first days as chief of police, he wanted me to meet him to introduce him to some of the cops and the captains at the district stations. I believe it was on a Saturday, and we first met at Central Station. He spoke briefly to the captain at Central Station. I don't remember who that was. And then we went down to the Tenderloin Task Force. He met with the captain down there. At the time, I believe his name was Gary Jimenez. They spoke briefly. I wasn't part of the conversation. And then I don't know if we were driving together or if the conversation took place the next day, but he told me that he was sort of appalled by the homelessness, the drug dealing, and things that he saw in the Tenderloin area, and he was sort of baffled that this was allowed to go on, and he asked me questions about why that would be so pervasive. And I told him that we have a huge homeless problem, and we didn't have enough cops and narcotics, and the Tenderloin was a problem. It was a challenge, and he was definitely disappointed in what he saw in the Tenderloin.
Okay. So back to the sweep of the Tenderloin. What in fact happened?
I think what happened shortly thereafter was that George Gascon ordered a sweep, if you will, of the Tenderloin to round up as many drug dealers and transients and homeless people and whatever, to basically clean up the area. And as I understand it, over the next month there was over 800 arrests at the orders of Chief George Gascon. Most of those people were either poverty-stricken or people of color, Hispanic or African American, and it was something that definitely happened and can certainly be traced through the statistics in the San Francisco Police Department if anybody did a little bit of legwork or investigation.
Do you have any sense as to whether that event or an event like that would have an impact on the police department's relations with the community?
Well, San Francisco is a very different place, as we know, and we are a very diverse, tolerant people. But politically in San Francisco, unlike a lot of cities, the Board of Supervisors did not always want to take aggressive action against quality of life crimes. And our cops act on the direction of the politics at City Hall. And so, quality of life crimes such as drug dealing and homelessness and larceny and petty theft and auto break-ins were never a big priority in San Francisco, so it just kind of came with the territory.
Are you aware of an organization called Officers for Justice?
Yes.
Okay, can you tell me what your knowledge of that organization is?
Officers for Justice is a organization that represents a large number of African American officers in the San Francisco Police Department, and just about all of those officers are also members of the Police Officers Association, so they have dual membership with the POA and also the Officers for Justice. Not exclusively African American, but primarily African American.
Okay. Do you have any recollection of then Chief Gascon expressing any opinion to you about the organization Officers for Justice?
Yes.
Okay. In what context did that arise?
He asked me to attend a meeting that he was having with the other employee organizations, the Officers for Justice being one of those organizations. The reason for the meeting was to get input from those four organizations, the LPOA, which is the Latin POA, Latin Police Officer Association, the APOA, Asian Police Officer Association, Pride Alliance, which is primarily LGBT, and Officers for Justice, and they wanted to meet with the chief to give recommendations on who they thought should be on the command staff, and he asked me to sit in on that meeting. I didn't really want to, but he asked me to just sort of act as a mediator or consultant on what they were telling him.
What did he express to you about his views of Officers for Justice in particular?
After the meeting, and there were certain things said in that room by the organizations which bothered him. Without getting into detail, I will get into detail if you ask me to. But after the meeting, he said to me that they seemed to be a organization in disarray with very poor leadership.
Okay, and that was particularly Officers for Justice.
Yes.
All right. In his role as police chief, did George Gascon ever make any statements to you regarding his belief concerning the qualifications of African American officers for command staff positions?
After that meeting, we spoke, I don't know if we spoke on more than one occasion, about what he perceived as a lack of qualified candidates at the rank of captain. And the African Americans not qualified at the rank of captain to go to the command staff, and asked me if I had any recommendations for him for command staff qualifications, people that I thought might be qualified to be on the command staff.
Okay, but did you agree with his assessment?
At the time, I wasn't sure how many African American captains we had. I wasn't even sure who they were. So I don't think I grilled him on it. I don't think it was a lengthy conversation. I think my attitude was more, well, if you feel that way, you feel that way. So, what do you want out of me?
Did you provide him with any recommendations?
Yes, I did. I provided him of a lieutenant who was a rank below captain, and I said, if you're not happy with the captains, then perhaps Lieutenant Kit Crenshaw would be a possible recommendation, because I found him to be qualified, knew him for a long time, worked with him in narcotics, and I knew that he was very popular and respected by just about everybody in the department, regardless of his ethnicity.
And did Chief Gascon act on your recommendation?
He did, in fact. I don't know if I was the only one, but he did, in fact, appoint Kit Crenshaw to commander on the San Francisco Police Department. Yes.
To your knowledge, did he ever promote another African American to his command staff?
No, and to the contrary, the only there may have been more than one, but one of the people that were demoted off the command staff was, in fact, an African American woman, Sylvia Harper.
All right. What about the current chief, Chief Greg Sir? What has Chief Sir done in regard to diversifying the command staff?
I wouldn't look at the numbers. I haven't looked at the numbers, but I can certainly tell you that Greg Sir has promoted to the command staff many, many, many more people of color, many more gay officers, and has done a much, much more thorough job of making sure that people of color and people of different ethnicities have been promoted to the command staff. I think he's probably, I'm guessing, but I will bet that there's been at least 10 promotions to the command staff by Chief Sir of people of color and gay and women and the other protected classes in the department. And George Gascon only promoted one, as far as I can recall.
Okay. Do you have any recollection during his term as chief of George Gascon making any statements to you that you believe showed racial bias or animosity?
We had the dinner, I guess the dinner that we had back in Cambridge and Boston in 2010, which was attended by myself, Chris Breen, Marty Halloran, and George Gascon. There were some things said by George Gascon that were, to say the least, surprising.
Okay. We'll get into that in a minute, but by way of background, why were you and those individuals in Cambridge, Massachusetts?
Every year, the 50 largest police unions meet at Harvard to discuss the issues of the day, and we've been attending for years, and George Gascon had recently been appointed chief of police, and had a reputation in law enforcement circles. He had been involved with PERF back in D.C., and so the conversation took place between the people that run the seminar. Would he like to come and speak?
You mentioned PERF. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, I don't even know what PERF stands for. It's the law enforcement think tank back in D.C., run by Chuck Wexler and Bratton and several other retired chiefs of police, sort of the academia of police think tank that's run out of D.C., I believe.
And I think you indicated that Chief Gascon was asked to participate in some seminars or some
I actually
presentation?
asked him if he was interested in doing it, and he said he was. And then I spoke to Cynthia Brown, who runs the seminar every year, and she said, yeah, we'd like to have him. So there was a 1 or 2 hour block set aside for George Gascon to talk to the 50 largest police unions about Chief's role and the relationship with unions as he saw it, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. All right. So we sort of started on this topic by you mentioning a dinner in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Approximately when was that?
It's 2010, April of 2000. I think April 16th, 17th, 18th, 2010.
Okay, and it was during this
Yes.
whole
Right.
I guess convention.
Right.
Okay. So we started this by talking about, I guess, Chief Gascon making certain statements that you believe showed bias. What do you recall about that dinner and those statements?
Well, it was a friendly, cordial, social dinner at an Italian. I don't know if it was an Italian restaurant in Cambridge, and Mr. Gascon. I don't know if he was intoxicated, but he appeared to be intoxicated. I think he had too much to drink, and he started to open up about certain things, and it was a little bit surprising and shocking, some of the things he said, and we were just kind of sitting there going, wow, kind of interesting. And we didn't pursue it any further after that. It was just it was interesting and surprising.
Do you recall him making certain statements that you believe showed, some kind of particular bias?
Two statements that I remember him making specifically. He was talking about some cops that worked for him when he was a sergeant in Los Angeles, and he referred to them as dumb black guys. And the context of the conversation was that these guys had taken a side job with a rapper, and that they had gone out on a boat, and that there was cocaine on the boat and firearms, and the Coast Guard pulled the boat over, and these guys ultimately were disciplined and got in trouble for putting themselves in that position. I remember him referring to them as I think he said, 4 dumb black guys. And then I do remember the phrase fucking Mexicans, and that was referring to the influx of drug dealing in Los Angeles and East LA. And I know that his wife is Mexican. So I mean, I just thought it was, a slang thing that he was referring to, and I'm not at all surprised. He probably doesn't even remember saying it, because he was, in my opinion, in an altered state.
Was he? What was his demeanor? Was he loud? Was he?
Yeah, he was loud, and he was, and I had gotten to know him up to that point as sort of a subdued, introverted guy. But, as like a lot of people, once they start drinking, you see a different side of him, and he was definitely loud and somewhat overbearing, to the point where another patron of the restaurant actually came over and asked him to keep it down.
Can you describe that in a little more detail?
Yeah, I knew that he was becoming loud. He's the chief of police, so I wasn't going to take him on. But it was obvious that he was becoming loud and boisterous, and some of the things that he was saying could be taken the wrong way. And there was an African American patron, and I believe he walked over, and I remember him saying something like, "Hey, can you," specifically to Mr. Gascon, "can you keep it down? You're kind of being offensive." And that was the end of the conversation. And then shortly thereafter, the three of us kind of like, we better, let's get out of here.
Okay.
And we took him back to his hotel, and that was the last we saw of him.
And the three of you, meaning
Chris
you,
Breen, Marty Halloran, and myself, yes.
Okay. When he was making these statements, and particularly when the gentleman came over, how did you feel?
I was more, I've been a cop a long time. I'm not naive. And, cops can talk loud and cops can be rude. But based on what I had known about him up to that point, it was really surprising, different behavior than I'd ever seen from him before, because all my other dealings with him, he seemed to be a very guarded person, very careful about what he said.
Do you think his statements were appropriate in any way?
Yeah, I mean, most of the conversation was okay, but he did show this
Well, I
really.
mean, particularly when he used the phrase "dumb black guys" and whatever he said about Mexican.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't appropriate. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm shocked, and I haven't heard people say things like that before, but it was coming from him. It was like, wow, I didn't see that one coming.
Were you embarrassed by the whole circumstance, including someone having to actually come over and?
I was embarrassed after the guy came over, because I hadn't realized up to that point that it had reached that point. And I saw the guy walking over to the table. And when I saw the guy walking over to the table, I'm kind of like, uh-oh, this guy's going to say something, because I think we're too loud. And he specifically spoke to George.
And no one else in your group made or engaged in or encouraged the derogatory statements?
No.
All right.
It was sort of in the context of him boasting about his time in the LAPD, and I mean, I over the years, LA cops they can be very arrogant and very full of themselves, and George was obviously a guy who was very full of himself and wanted to let us know, he was an LAPD sergeant,
Okay.
that type of thing.
All right.
That's
thanks
how
for
I
your-
took it.
Oh, excuse me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.